What happens when the greatest warrior in the galaxy becomes a laughingstock overnight? When a legendary blade that once carved through starships like paper becomes nothing more than twisted metal and bitter memories? Commander Marcus Chen thought he knew the answer. Stripped of his rank, cast out from the Galactic Defense Force, and left with only the broken remnants of the weapon that once made him invincible, he believed his story was over. The alien councils mocked him. His former allies turned their backs. Even children pointed and whispered about the fallen hero with the useless sword. But, sometimes, the greatest power lies not in what appears whole, but in what seems irreparably broken. Sometimes, the universe's most devastating secrets hide behind the facade of failure. And, sometimes, those who laugh the loudest are about to discover why humans became the most feared species in the known galaxy. Marcus Chen is about to remind everyone why you should never underestimate a human with nothing left to lose. Especially when that human carries a weapon that was never meant to be understood by alien minds. The question isn't whether they'll stop laughing. The question is whether any of them will survive long enough to regret it. The cantina on Nexus Station reeked of desperation and cheap synthetic alcohol. Through the haze of smoke and broken dreams, Commander Marcus Chen sat alone at a corner table, staring at the twisted fragments of metal before him. What had once been the legendary Void Cutter, a blade capable of slicing through the hulls of dreadnoughts, now looked like nothing more than expensive scrap. The conversations around him buzzed with the familiar mixture of languages that made Nexus Station the crossroads of the galaxy. Traders, mercenaries, and refugees from a dozen different worlds all mingled together in this floating city between the stars. But, tonight, Marcus could feel their eyes on him. Some stared with curiosity, others with pity, but most looked at him with barely concealed amusement. "Isn't that the human who used to command the Stellar Vanguard?" whispered a Zephyrian merchant to his companion, his blue-scaled face twisted in a sneer. "The one who claimed his primitive weapon could cut through anything?" His companion, a reptilian Vorthak with golden eyes, hissed with laughter. "Look at him now. Reduced to drinking alone with the broken pieces of his toy sword. These humans and their delusions of grandeur." Marcus kept his expression neutral, though his knuckles whitened as he gripped his glass. He had heard variations of this conversation 1,000 times over the past 3 months. Ever since the Battle of Kepler's Edge, where his sword had been shattered by the reality-warping technology of the Ethereal Collective, his reputation had crumbled faster than an asteroid in a star's gravity well. The door to the cantina hissed open, and Marcus glanced up to see a familiar figure approaching. Captain Thorn, his former second-in-command, moved through the crowd with the confident stride of someone still wearing the pristine uniform of the Galactic Defense Force. His human features were set in a mask of professional indifference, but Marcus could see the discomfort in his old friend's eyes. "Marcus," Thorn said as he reached the table, his voice carefully neutral. "Mind if I sit?" Marcus gestured to the empty chair across from him without looking up from the sword fragments. "Depends. Are you here as a friend or as a representative of Admiral Kane?" Thorn settled into the chair with a soft sigh. "Both, I suppose." He glanced at the broken weapon on the table. "The Admiral wants to see you." "Let me guess," Marcus said, finally, raising his eyes to meet Thorn's gaze. "The great human hero needs to gracefully retire from public view. Stop embarrassing the GDF with my presence. Maybe find a nice quiet colony world where I can fade into obscurity." "It's not like that," Thorn protested, though his tone lacked conviction. "The Admiral recognizes your service. Your contributions to the war effort were invaluable. But, after Kepler's Edge, everyone realized that the legendary Void Cutter was just an ordinary sword," Marcus finished bitterly. "That humanity's supposed superiority was built on nothing more than smoke and mirrors." Thorn leaned forward, lowering his voice. "That's not true, and you know it. Your tactical brilliance, your leadership, your ability to inspire troops, none of that had anything to do with the sword. You're still the same man who held the line at Proxima, who broke the siege of New Terra, who led the charge at the Battle of the Twin Suns." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Tell that to the Galactic Council. Tell that to the Ethereal Collective, who are probably still laughing about how easily they neutralized humanity's greatest weapon. Tell that to the thousands of soldiers who believed in me because they thought I carried something special. The conversation at nearby tables had grown quieter, and Marcus realized that more people were listening in. Word would spread quickly through the station that the fallen human commander was having a very public conversation with an active GDF officer. By tomorrow, the story would reach a dozen star systems. The sword was special, Thorn insisted. Just because it broke doesn't mean it means exactly what everyone thinks it means, Marcus interrupted. It was a piece of earth steel, enhanced with some basic molecular bonding technology. Impressive by human standards, but laughably primitive compared to what the older races can produce. The ethereals proved that when they shattered it with a single pulse from their reality disruptor. Marcus reached out and picked up one of the larger fragments, turning it over in his hands. The metal still felt warm to the touch, which had puzzled him for months. Every analysis had shown that the fragments were completely inert, just broken pieces of an ordinary weapon. Yet they always seemed to retain heat, as if some invisible fire still burned within the steel. I've run every test imaginable on these pieces, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Quantum resonance scans, temporal field analysis, even consciousness mapping protocols that half the galaxy considers pseudoscience. Nothing. No exotic particles, no dimensional anomalies, no trace of the energy matrix that used to let me cut through shields and armor like they were made of paper. Thorn watched his friend with growing concern. In the 3 months since Kepler's Edge, Marcus had become obsessed with understanding what had happened to his weapon. The man who had once been decisive and forward-thinking now spent his days locked in laboratories and research facilities, desperately searching for answers that might not exist. Maybe it's time to let go, Thorn suggested gently. The war is changing. New technologies, new strategies. The Council is developing weapons that make the old blade technology look primitive anyway. Phase disruptors, quantum lance arrays, reality anchors that can neutralize anything the ethereals throw at us. You're missing the point, Marcus said, setting the fragment back on the table with careful precision. This isn't about winning the war. This is about understanding what we lost. Around them, the cantina had grown noticeably quieter. Even the most boisterous groups of traitors and mercenaries seemed to sense the tension at Marcus's table. The fallen commander's reputation might be in ruins, but there was still something about his presence that commanded attention. A new voice cut through the silence, sharp and mocking. Well. If it isn't the great human warrior, communing with the remains of his precious toy. Marcus looked up to see Ambassador Kethril approaching their table. The ethereal's form shifted and flickered like a hologram, his features never quite settling into a fixed configuration. As one of the beings responsible for the current war, Kethril represented everything that Marcus had been fighting against for the past 5 years. Ambassador, Marcus said evenly, not rising from his seat. I wasn't aware that ethereals frequented establishments like this. Kethril's form solidified into something resembling a tall, pale humanoid with eyes like swirling galaxies. Oh, I make it a point to observe the local customs wherever I travel. And I couldn't pass up the opportunity to see the legendary Marcus Chen in his current, diminished state. Several patrons at nearby tables shifted uncomfortably. The presence of an ethereal in the cantina was unusual enough, but the tension between the two beings was palpable. Everyone knew the story of Kepler's Edge, where Kethril had personally overseen the destruction of Marcus's weapon. I trust you're satisfied with your victory, Marcus said, his voice carefully controlled. Your reality disruptor performed exactly as intended. Indeed it did, Kethril replied, his form flickering with what might have been amusement. Though I must confess, I expected more of a challenge from humanity's greatest champion. The ease with which your weapon succumbed to our technology was disappointing. Thorn's hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm, but Marcus caught his wrist with a gentle but firm grip. Starting a firefight in a crowded cantina would only make things worse, and the GDF didn't need any more diplomatic incidents. Disappointed? Marcus asked, genuinely curious. I would have thought you'd be pleased to eliminate what your people considered a significant threat. Kethril's form shifted again, taking on a more angular appearance. Threat? My dear commander, your sword was never a threat to us. It was, at best, an interesting curiosity. We destroyed it not out of fear, but out of academic interest. The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Around them, the cantina had fallen completely silent. Even the ambient music from the bar's sound system seemed muted. Academic interest, Marcus repeated slowly. Oh yes, Kethril continued, clearly enjoying himself. You see, we ethereals have encountered weapons like yours before. Primitive civilizations often develop crude reality manipulation tools as they begin to understand the deeper structures of the universe. Your species simply happened to stumble upon one of the more effective designs. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a cold anger that he had been suppressing for months. Are you saying that humans didn't create the Void Cutter? Create? Kethril laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a storm. Oh, you created the physical shell, certainly. But, the underlying principles, the energy matrix that gave it power, that technology is older than your entire civilization. The ethereal began to pace around the table, his form shifting with each step. The quantum resonance patterns, the dimensional phase alignments, the consciousness interface protocols, all of it dates back to the earliest days of galactic civilization. Your people simply found fragments of this ancient knowledge and reverse-engineered them into a crude but functional weapon. Marcus's grip on his glass tightened until the material began to crack. And, you destroyed it to prove some point about human inferiority? We destroyed it because we could, Kethril said simply. Because it represented a technology that belonged to more advanced species. Consider it a correction of the natural order. The silence in the cantina was deafening. Even Thorn seemed frozen in place, his eyes moving between Marcus and the ethereal with growing alarm. Everyone in the room could sense that something was about to happen, though none of them could guess what form it might take. Marcus slowly set down his cracked glass and stood up. He was not a particularly tall man, barely average height by human standards, but something about his posture made him seem to fill the room. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational. Ambassador Kethril, I want to thank you for that explanation. It's been quite enlightening. Kethril's form flickered with what might have been confusion. Indeed? I'm pleased that you're taking this revelation with such grace. Marcus reached down and carefully gathered the fragments of his shattered sword, placing them in a worn leather pouch that he tucked inside his jacket. Tell me, Ambassador, in all your studies of ancient technology, did you ever encounter any mention of failsafes? Failsafes? Kethril's voice took on a wary tone. Yes, Marcus said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Built-in protections. Security measures designed to prevent unauthorized users from accessing certain capabilities. The ethereal's form began to shift more rapidly, cycling through different configurations as if he couldn't quite decide which shape to maintain. What are you implying, Commander? Marcus straightened his jacket and nodded to Thorn, who was still sitting in stunned silence. I'm not implying anything, Ambassador. I'm simply wondering if your people ever considered the possibility that what you destroyed at Kepler's Edge wasn't the real weapon at all. Before anyone could respond, Marcus turned and walked toward the cantina's exit. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back over his shoulder. Oh, and, Ambassador? You might want to inform your superiors that humanity's real weapons don't break quite so easily. The door hissed shut behind him, leaving the cantina in absolute silence. Kethril stood frozen in place, his form flickering wildly as he processed what he had just heard. Thorn stared at the empty doorway with his mouth slightly open, while the other patrons whispered among themselves in hushed tones. Outside the cantina, Marcus Chan walked through the corridors of Nexus Station with a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in months. For the first time since Kepler's Edge, he wasn't running from his failure, he was running towards something far more important. The fragments in his jacket seemed to pulse with warmth against his chest, and, for just a moment, Marcus could have sworn he heard something that sounded almost like a heartbeat. 3 days after his confrontation with Ambassador Kethril, Marcus found himself standing in the ruins of the Prometheus Research Station, located in the outer rim of the Vega system. The facility had been abandoned for over a century, left to drift in the shadow of a dying star after the Great Plague of 2387 had wiped out its entire population. Now it served as Marcus's private laboratory, a place where he could work without the watchful eyes of the Galactic Defense Force or the prying sensors of alien intelligence agencies. The station's artificial gravity was still functional, though the lighting flickered intermittently and the air recycling systems produced a constant background hum that had taken Marcus weeks to get used to. He had spent the last 72 hours in the main laboratory, surrounded by equipment that he had quietly requisitioned from various sources across the galaxy. Some of it was legal. Most of it wasn't. Marcus held one of the larger sword fragments up to the light of a quantum microscope, watching as streams of data float across the display screens around him. The molecular structure of the metal was exactly what it should be, enhanced steel with trace elements of exotic matter that had allowed it to maintain its edge at the quantum level. Nothing that shouldn't be there. Nothing that would explain why the fragments still felt warm to the touch. "Computer, run a deep field scan on sample 7 alpha, he said aloud, his voice echoing in the empty laboratory. The station's ancient AI responded with a mechanical voice that had seen better decades. Initiating deep field analysis. Warning, this scan exceeds safety parameters for standard metallurgical examination. Do you wish to proceed? Proceed. Marcus stepped back as the scanning array descended from the ceiling, surrounding the sword fragment with a complex web of energy fields. The deep field scanner was a piece of experimental technology that he had borrowed from a black market dealer on Titan Station. It was designed to detect quantum signatures at levels so minute that most scientists considered them theoretical at best. The scan began with a low harmonic vibration that seemed to resonate through the entire laboratory. Marcus watched the readouts carefully, looking for any anomaly that might explain what had happened at Kepler's edge. For months, he had been haunted by the memory of that battle. Not just the moment when his sword had shattered, but everything that had led up to it. The ethereal fleet had appeared without warning in the Kepler system, their reality warping ships emerging from dimensional tiers in spacetime itself. Marcus had led the GDF response, commanding a fleet of humanity's most advanced vessels in what everyone knew would be a decisive battle. The ethereals had been pushing deeper into human space for months, and if they took Kepler's edge, the core worlds would be defenseless. Marcus remembered the moment when he had boarded the ethereal command ship, his sword cutting through their exotic armor and energy shields as if they were made of mist. For 20 minutes, it had seemed like humanity might actually win. Then, Ambassador Kethril had appeared with his reality disruptor, and everything had changed. The weapon hadn't just broken his sword, it had seemed to analyze it first, probing its structure with tendrils of impossible energy before delivering the killing blow. At the time, Marcus had assumed it was simply the ethereal's way of ensuring complete destruction. Now, he was beginning to suspect something else entirely. A soft chime from the scanner brought him back to the present. The readouts showed normal metallic composition, standard quantum resonance patterns, and absolutely no trace of the exotic energy that had once flowed through the blade like liquid fire. But, as Marcus studied the data more closely, he noticed something odd. The quantum signature wasn't completely random. There was a pattern hidden in the subatomic structure, so faint that it barely registered on his instruments. It looked almost like code. Computer, isolate the quantum resonance pattern from sectors 7 through 12 and run it through the Xenolinguistics database. Processing. This may take several minutes. While the computer worked, Marcus walked over to the laboratory's main viewport and stared out at the dying star that dominated the local sky. The red giant was in its final stages of collapse, its surface racked with solar storms that painted the surrounding nebula in brilliant shades of orange and gold. In a few thousand years, it would go supernova, destroying everything within a dozen light-years. But, for now, it provided the perfect backdrop for contemplating the mysteries of the universe. A new voice interrupted his thoughts, speaking from the laboratory's communication array. "Marcus, are you there?" He recognized Dr. Sarah Chen immediately, his sister and one of the galaxy's leading experts in xenotechnology. Sarah worked for the GDF's research division, but she had always been willing to bend the rules when it came to helping her brother. The fact that she was contacting him on an unsecured channel meant that whatever she had to say was important. "Sarah," Marcus said, activating the comm system. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you." "I've been trying to reach you for 2 days," Sarah's voice crackled through the aging communication equipment. "Where are you? The locator beacon on your ship shows you're in the middle of nowhere." Marcus glanced around the abandoned laboratory. "I'm conducting some private research. Nothing that would interest the GDF." Everything you do interests the GDF right now, Sarah replied sharply. Especially after your little performance at that cantina. Half the Galactic Council thinks you've lost your mind, and the other half thinks you're planning something dangerous. Marcus couldn't help but smile. His sister had always been direct, even when they were children growing up in the colony domes of New Shanghai. While Marcus had dreamed of becoming a soldier, Sarah had been fascinated by the alien technologies that were beginning to filter into human space. Their paths had diverged early, but they had always remained close. What if I told you I think I've found something? Marcus asked. Something about the sword that nobody else has noticed. There was a long pause before Sarah responded. I'd say that you've been obsessing over those fragments for 3 months, and that maybe it's time to accept that some things are just broken beyond repair. The quantum resonance patterns aren't random, Marcus said, walking back over to the scanner display. There's structure hidden in the subatomic matrix. It looks almost like a data storage system. Data storage? Sarah's voice took on a more interested tone. What kind of data? Before Marcus could respond, the computer chimed again. Analysis complete. The quantum patterns show significant correlation with ancient precursor linguistic structures. Confidence level, 73%. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. The precursors were a legendary race that had supposedly existed millions of years ago, before any of the current galactic civilizations had evolved beyond primitive tool use. Most scientists considered them mythical, a convenient explanation for various unexplained phenomena throughout known space. Sarah, did you hear that? I heard it, Sarah replied, her voice tight with excitement. But, Marcus, if those patterns are really precursor in origin, then, your sword wasn't just enhanced with ancient technology, it was built using a completely different paradigm of physics. Marcus began pacing around the laboratory, his mind racing with possibilities. That would explain why the ethereals were so interested in destroying it. They weren't eliminating a threat, they were covering up evidence. Evidence of what? Evidence that humanity had access to technology that predates their entire civilization, Marcus said. Technology that might be far more advanced than anything currently known in the galaxy. The communication channel crackled with static for a moment before Sarah spoke again. Marcus, I need you to listen to me very carefully. If what you're suggesting is true, then, you're in more danger than you realize. The ethereals aren't the only ones who would want to suppress this kind of discovery. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at the sword fragments on his workbench. What do you mean? The Galactic Council has strict protocols regarding precursor artifacts, Sarah explained. Any discovery of authentic precursor technology is immediately classified and turned over to the Archive Authority for containment. They consider it too dangerous for individual species to possess. Dangerous how? The precursors didn't just master physics and engineering, Sarah said. According to the few verified accounts we have, they developed technologies that could manipulate consciousness itself. Reality-shaping devices that operated on principles so advanced that they might as well be magic. Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He thought about the way his sword had always seemed to anticipate his intentions, how it had never felt like a separate tool but rather like an extension of his own will. He had assumed it was simply a matter of familiarity and training. Now he was beginning to wonder if there had been something far more profound at work. Sarah, I need access to the Archive Authority's databases. Specifically, their files on precursor linguistics and consciousness interface technologies. Are you insane? Sarah's voice rose sharply. Those files are classified beyond anything I have access to. Even requesting permission to view them would trigger security protocols that could end both our careers. Then, don't request permission, Marcus said quietly. The communication channel fell silent for a long moment. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Marcus, what you're asking me to do, if we get caught, we won't just lose our positions. We could face charges of sedition, theft of classified materials, violation of the Galactic Security Act. They could exile us to the Outer Rim for the rest of our lives. Marcus picked up one of the sword fragments and held it up to the light. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw patterns of light moving within the metal itself, like circuits of pure energy flowing just beneath the surface. Sarah, what if I told you that I don't think the sword was destroyed at Kepler's edge? What if what everyone saw was just the physical shell breaking apart, while the real weapon, the consciousness interface matrix, survived intact? I'd say that you're talking about technology that shouldn't be possible, Sarah replied. Consciousness doesn't just survive the destruction of its physical substrate. When the brain dies, the mind dies with it. Unless the mind was never truly biological to begin with, Marcus said. Unless it was something that existed in a completely different dimensional framework, something that could maintain coherence even after its anchor point in normal spacetime was severed. The laboratory's emergency lighting suddenly activated, bathing everything in a red glow that made the sword fragments seem to pulse with their own inner fire. Marcus looked around in confusion, trying to understand what had triggered the alert system. Computer, what's the cause of the emergency status? Unknown energy signature detected, the AI responded. Source appears to be internal to the laboratory. Recommend immediate evacuation. Marcus looked down at the fragments in his hand and realized that they were definitely glowing now, not with reflected light but with energy that seemed to come from deep within the metal itself. The warmth that he had noticed for months was becoming genuine heat, and he could feel vibrations running through the broken pieces like a slow, steady heartbeat. Sarah, he said, his voice tight with excitement and fear. I think something is happening. What kind of something? Before Marcus could respond, the laboratory filled with a sound that defied description. It wasn't quite music and it wasn't quite language, but it seemed to resonate directly with his consciousness in a way that bypassed his ears entirely. The sword fragments in his hand began to vibrate in harmony with the sound, and, suddenly, Marcus could feel something that he had thought was lost forever. The presence. For 5 years, from the moment he had first touched the void cutter, Marcus had been aware of something else sharing his consciousness. Not a voice, not a personality, but a sense of vast intelligence that guided his actions in combat. He had never spoken about it to anyone, not even Sarah, because he hadn't been sure if it was real or simply a manifestation of his own enhanced reflexes and tactical instincts. Now, as the fragments glowed brighter in his hands, Marcus realized that the presence had never left. It had simply been waiting. Marcus? Sarah's voice came from very far away. Marcus, are you still there? He tried to respond, but found that he couldn't form words. The presence in his mind was growing stronger, more defined, and, suddenly, Marcus understood that he was not alone in the laboratory. He had never been alone, not since the day he had first grasped the hilt of an ancient weapon that had been waiting millions of years for someone capable of understanding its true nature. The sword fragments rose from his hands and began to orbit around him like tiny satellites, each piece tracing complex patterns in the air. As they moved, they left trails of energy that began to form geometric shapes of impossible complexity. Marcus watched in fascination as the shapes grew more elaborate, creating a three-dimensional mandala that seemed to extend into dimensions that his eyes couldn't quite perceive. And then, in the center of it all, something began to materialize. It wasn't the sword as he had known it. This was something far more complex, far more alive. The blade that took shape was made not of metal but of crystallized light, its surface reflecting realities that existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time. The hilt formed from patterns of pure mathematics, equations that described the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. When the transformation was complete, the weapon hung suspended in the air before Marcus, waiting. He reached out slowly and grasped the hilt, feeling the familiar warmth flow through his arm and into his mind. But, this time, the presence that accompanied the connection was no longer silent. Hello, Marcus, it said, its voice like the sound of stars being born. It's time for you to learn what you really are. The voice that spoke in Marcus's mind carried with it the weight of eons. As his fingers closed around the hilt of the transformed weapon, reality itself seemed to shift around him. The abandoned laboratory dissolved like mist, replaced by something that existed outside the normal boundaries of space and time. Marcus found himself standing in what could only be described as a library, though that word failed to capture the true nature of what surrounded him. Vast columns of crystallized knowledge stretched infinitely upward, each one containing the compressed experiences and wisdom of entire civilizations. Between the columns flowed rivers of liquid light, carrying information from one part of this impossible space to another. Do not be afraid, the presence said, and now Marcus could sense that it was both ancient and alien, yet somehow fundamentally connected to his own consciousness. This is the archive of all things, the repository of knowledge created by those you call the precursors. You are safe here. Marcus looked down at himself and was surprised to see that his body appeared unchanged, though he seemed to exist here as much as a pattern of thought and memory as flesh and blood. The weapon in his hand had become something even more extraordinary, not just a sword, but a key that unlocked doors between dimensions. What are you? Marcus asked, his voice echoing strangely in this space between realities. I am what remains of the architect, the presence replied. The last of the precursors, preserved not as flesh but as pure consciousness within the matrices of our greatest creations. Your people call me many names, the Void-Touched, the Starforger, the Guardian of the Deep Ways. But I prefer a simpler designation. I am the one who has been waiting. Marcus began to walk through the archive, his footsteps leaving ripples of energy that spread out across surfaces that seemed to be made of solidified time itself. As he moved, he began to understand that this place was not just a library but a living monument to a civilization so advanced that they had transcended the normal limitations of existence. Waiting for what? Marcus asked. Waiting for humanity, the architect replied. Waiting for a species that would prove worthy of inheriting our legacy. The declaration hit Marcus like a physical blow. He stopped walking and stared up at the endless columns of knowledge that surrounded him. You're saying that all of this entire archive, was meant for us? Not just for you, the architect corrected. For any species that could demonstrate the qualities necessary to wield our technology responsibly. In the millions of years since our physical forms perished, we have watched countless civilizations rise and fall. We have tested them, challenged them, offered them glimpses of power beyond their comprehension. Most failed. Some spectacularly as if summoned by the architect's words, images began to appear in the air around Marcus. He saw alien races that had discovered precursor artifacts and used them to wage wars of unimaginable destruction. Civilizations that had tried to reverse engineer precursor technology and accidentally torn holes in reality itself. Species that had become so dependent on inherited power that they had forgotten how to grow and evolve on their own. The ethereals, Marcus said, understanding beginning to dawn. They found precursor technology too, didn't they? Indeed. They were among the first to discover our ruins after we transcended physical existence. But they approached our legacy with greed and impatience, seeking to steal power rather than earn it. They learned to mimic our technology but never understood its true purpose. The images shifted, showing Marcus glimpses of the ethereal civilization in its early stages. They had been a proud and ancient race even then, convinced of their own superiority over younger species. When they had found the first precursor ruins, they had immediately set about trying to claim them as their own inheritance. They succeeded in reproducing some of our simpler devices, the architect continued. Reality disruptors, dimensional phase engines, consciousness dampening fields. But they could never access the deeper mysteries. They lacked the one quality that we had built into all of our most important creations, the ability to think beyond themselves. Marcus thought about his years of service in the Galactic Defense Force, about the countless battles he had fought to protect human colonies from ethereal aggression. So the war, this entire conflict, it's really about competing claims to precursor technology? In part, yes. But it is also about something far more important. It is about determining which species will guide the galaxy into its next phase of evolution. The archive around them began to change, the columns of knowledge rearranging themselves into new configurations. Marcus found himself standing at the center of what looked like a vast amphitheater, with tiers of crystalline seats extending out in all directions. But, instead of being empty, each seat was occupied by a figure made of light and memory, the preserved consciousness of a precursor. Welcome, Marcus Chen, they said in unison, their combined voice carrying the harmonics of 1,000 different musical traditions. We are the council of the last, those who chose to remain behind when our people transcended to higher dimensions. We have been your judges, and we have found you worthy. Marcus felt simultaneously honored and terrified. He was standing before beings whose civilization had spanned millions of star systems and whose technology was indistinguishable from magic. The fact that they considered him worthy of anything seemed impossible to believe. "I don't understand," he said. "I'm just a soldier. I've spent my entire career following orders, fighting wars, trying to protect people who can't protect themselves. How does that make me worthy of this?" "Because that is precisely what worthiness means," the architect replied, his voice now echoing with the approval of the entire council. "You have never sought power for its own sake. You have never used your abilities to dominate others. When faced with impossible odds, you have stood firm not because you were certain of victory, but because you knew that someone had to stand." The weapon in Marcus's hand began to change again, its crystalline structure becoming more complex as new capabilities awakened within its matrix. He could feel knowledge flowing into his mind, not just tactical information, but deep understanding of technologies that could reshape matter and energy at the fundamental level. "The sword," Marcus said, looking down at the transformed weapon. "It was never just a tool, was it? It was a test." "The Void Cutter was indeed a test," the council confirmed. "But not in the way you might think. We did not craft it to evaluate your combat skills or strategic thinking. We created it to measure your character under pressure, to see how you would wield ultimate power when the fate of your people hung in the balance." Marcus remembered all the battles he had fought with the sword, all the moments when he could have used its reality-shaping capabilities for personal gain or political advantage. He had always chosen the path of service, using the weapon only to protect others and never for conquest or revenge. "For 5 years, you carried a device that could have made you emperor of the known galaxy," the architect said. "You could have used it to force the other species into submission, to claim the best worlds for humanity, to ensure that your people would never again face the threat of extinction. Instead, you used it to build alliances, to protect the weak, to fight for a vision of the future where all sentient beings could coexist in peace." The amphitheater began to dissolve around them, replaced by a view of the galaxy itself as seen from some impossible vantage point beyond normal spacetime. Marcus could see the spiral arms of the Milky Way spread out before him, with thousands of star systems marked by different colors to indicate the various civilizations that called them home. Human space was represented by warm golden light, but Marcus could see that it occupied only a tiny fraction of the galaxy. The ethereal territories glowed with cold silver radiance and covered nearly a quarter of the visible stars. Other colors marked the domains of the Zephyrians, the Vorthak, the Crystalline Collective, and dozens of species that Marcus had never even heard of. "This is what you're fighting for," Marcus said, finally, beginning to understand the true scope of the conflict. "Not just human survival, but the future of galactic civilization itself." "Precisely, the council replied. The ethereals would impose their vision of order through domination and control. They see the younger races as resources to be managed, not as partners in the great work of cosmic evolution. If they triumph, the galaxy will stagnate for millions of years, locked in a rigid hierarchy that stifles growth and discovery. The view shifted, showing Marcus what the galaxy might look like under ethereal rule. The golden lights of human space had been extinguished, along with most of the other younger civilizations. What remained was a cold, sterile empire where innovation was forbidden and individual consciousness was suppressed in favor of collective obedience. "But humanity offers a different path?" Marcus asked. "Humanity offers the possibility of true synthesis," the architect replied. "Your species has shown a unique ability to adapt and integrate technologies and ideas from other civilizations while maintaining your own essential nature. You do not seek to dominate or be dominated, but to find ways for different forms of consciousness to work together toward common goals." Marcus thought about the crews of GDF ships, where humans served alongside aliens from dozens of different worlds. He thought about the colonies where multiple species had built new societies together, combining their different strengths and perspectives to create something greater than the sum of their parts. "This is why we chose to make our final gift available to your people," the council said. This is why the Void Cutter was placed where human explorers would find it. You were meant to discover not just a weapon, but the key to unlocking the next phase of galactic evolution. The weapon in Marcus's hand pulsed with new energy as additional systems came online. He could feel vast databases of knowledge opening to his consciousness, containing not just military applications but technologies for healing, creation, and transformation. The sword was no longer just a tool of war, it was a bridge between different forms of existence. What happens now? Marcus asked. The ethereals destroyed the physical blade at Kepler's edge. Everyone believes that humanity's greatest weapon has been eliminated. Which is exactly what we intended, the architect replied with what might have been amusement. The destruction of the Voidcutter's physical form was not a defeat, it was the final stage of your testing. By witnessing the loss of your most powerful weapon and choosing to continue fighting anyway, you demonstrated that humanity's true strength lies not in any device or technology, but in the character of your people themselves. The archive began to fade around them, and Marcus realized that he was being returned to normal spacetime. But, as the transition began, the council spoke one final time. Go now, Marcus Chen. Return to your war, but not as the warrior you were before. You carry within you now the full legacy of the precursors, freely given and without reservation. Use it wisely, for the future of all sentient life depends upon the choices you make in the days to come. The last thing Marcus saw before the archive disappeared was a final image of the galaxy, but this time showing not what was or what might be, but what could be. Every star system blazed with the light of thriving civilizations, connected by networks of communication and trade that spanned impossible distances. Different species worked together on projects so vast and ambitious that they redefined the very concept of achievement. It was a vision of the future that was worth fighting for. Marcus opened his eyes to find himself back in the laboratory on Prometheus Station. The sword in his hands had returned to its original appearance, but he could feel the vast power that now flowed through its familiar form. More importantly, he could feel the knowledge that had been gifted to him, understanding of technologies and principles that would give humanity the tools it needed to not just survive the coming conflict, but to reshape the galaxy itself. The communication channel was still active, carrying Sarah's increasingly frantic voice. Marcus! Marcus, answer me. The energy readings from your location are off the charts. Marcus smiled and activated his end of the channel. I'm here, Sarah. And I have some very interesting news to share with you. Thank God, Sarah breathed. I was about to send a rescue team. What happened? The sensors recorded energy signatures that shouldn't be possible. Marcus looked out at the dying star that dominated the view from the laboratory. Soon, he would have to leave this place and return to the war. But now he understood that he wouldn't be going back as the same man who had fled in defeat from Kepler's edge. He would be returning as something new, not just a warrior, but a herald of the future itself. Sarah, he said quietly, I need you to arrange a meeting with Admiral Kane and the Galactic Council. Tell them that humanity is ready to propose a new strategy for ending the war. A new strategy? Marcus, what are you talking about? Marcus raised the sword and watched as patterns of light flowed along its edge, not the crude energy matrices of human technology, but something far more elegant and profound. The weapon that had once been considered humanity's greatest achievement was now revealed to be merely the key to powers that defied imagination. I'm talking about winning, Marcus said. Not just the war, but the peace that comes after. The Great Council chamber aboard the GDF flagship Indomitable had never hosted a meeting quite like this one. Representatives from 17 different species sat around a holographic display table that showed the current tactical situation across 3 sectors of contested space. The ethereal advance had accelerated dramatically over the past month, with their reality-warping fleets pushing deeper into civilian territories than ever before. Admiral Kane stood at the head of the table, his weathered face reflecting the strain of commanding humanity's forces in what many considered an unwinnable war. At 67, he had served the Galactic Defense Force for more than 4 decades, rising through the ranks during the Golden Age when peaceful exploration had seemed like humanity's destiny. Now he found himself presiding over the possible extinction of his species. The situation is deteriorating faster than our worst-case projections, Kane said, gesturing to the tactical display. The ethereals have taken Proxima Centauri, New Geneva, and the entire Kepler sector. At their current rate of advance, they'll reach Earth within 6 months. Ambassador Thissa of the Zephyrian Republic leaned forward, her blue-scaled features grim with concern. Our joint fleet actions have proven ineffective against their reality disruptors. Every engagement results in severe casualties for minimal strategic gain. Perhaps it is time to consider negotiating terms of surrender. The suggestion sent a wave of murmurs around the table, some species representatives nodding in agreement while others looked shocked at the very idea. The war had been raging for 5 years now, ever since the ethereals had emerged from whatever dimension they called home and begun their systematic conquest of the galaxy's younger civilizations. Surrender is not an option, declared General Kozak of the Vortak Defense Alliance, his reptilian voice carrying the rumble of barely controlled aggression. The ethereals do not negotiate. They subjugate. Any species that yields to them loses not just their freedom, but their very identity. Kane nodded grimly. The intelligence reports from occupied systems painted a horrifying picture of what ethereal rule meant for conquered populations. Entire planets transformed into sterile factory worlds, their inhabitants reduced to biological components in some vast machine of production and control. Which brings us to the reason for this emergency session, Kane continued. 3 days ago, we received a communication from Commander Marcus Chen requesting permission to present new intelligence that he claims could change the course of the war. The mention of Marcus's name brought a different kind of murmur from the assembled representatives. Everyone in the room knew the story of humanity's fallen champion and his broken sword. Most considered him a tragic figure, a reminder of how quickly fortune could turn in the cosmos. Ambassador Kethril materialized at his designated position around the table, his ethereal form flickering between states of existence as if he couldn't quite decide which reality to inhabit. His presence at council meetings was part of a long-standing diplomatic protocol, though most suspected he was there primarily to gather intelligence for his own people. How fascinating, Kethril said, his voice carrying its usual tone of condescending amusement. The great human hero returns from exile with promises of salvation. Tell me, Admiral, has your former champion finally accepted the reality of his situation, or does he still cling to delusions of past glory? Before Kane could respond, the chamber's blast doors opened with a sound like thunder. Marcus Chen stepped through, and immediately every being in the room could sense that something had changed about him. He still wore the simple gray uniform of a dishonored officer, and the sword at his side looked exactly as it had before its destruction at Kepler's Edge. But there was something in his bearing, a quality of presence that made even the most hardened warriors sit up straighter in their seats. Marcus walked to the center of the council chamber, his footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to every corner of the vast room. 3 months ago, I stood before this council as a defeated man, he began. My weapon had been destroyed, my reputation was in ruins, and humanity's greatest hope for victory had been reduced to scrap metal and bitter memories. Today, I return with knowledge that changes everything we thought we knew about this war. Kethril's form flickered more rapidly, cycling through different configurations as if he were agitated or confused. Commander Chen, while I appreciate the theater of your entrance, surely you must realize that your time for grand speeches has passed. The galaxy has moved beyond the need for human heroics. Marcus turned to face the ethereal ambassador directly, and, for just a moment, those with the most sensitive perception could have sworn they saw something else overlaying his human form, a pattern of light and energy that extended beyond the normal boundaries of three-dimensional space. Ambassador Kethril, you told me that my sword was based on primitive attempts to reverse engineer ancient technology, Marcus said. You were partially correct. The Void Cutter was indeed built using principles that humanity didn't fully understand. What you failed to mention is that this technology was placed within our reach deliberately, as part of a test that we have now passed. The council chamber erupted in excited conversation as representatives began talking among themselves in a dozen different languages. Kane raised his hand for silence, his expression unreadable as he studied his former protege. Commander, these are serious claims you're making, Kane said. I hope you're prepared to substantiate them. Marcus reached into his jacket and withdrew what appeared to be the same broken fragments that everyone had seen him carrying for months. But, as he placed them on the council table, something extraordinary happened. The pieces began to move on their own, floating through the air and reassembling themselves into new configurations. Within moments, they had formed a complex three-dimensional mandala that pulsed with inner light. The sword was never destroyed at Kepler's Edge, Marcus explained as the assembled delegates watched in stunned silence. What Ambassador Kethral's reality disruptor actually did was trigger a transformation sequence that had been built into the weapon millions of years ago. The precursors designed their technology to reveal its true nature only when the wielder was ready to understand its full potential. Kethral's form suddenly solidified into a tall, angular shape that radiated visible distress. Impossible. The precursors have been extinct for eons. Their technology is scattered across the galaxy in fragments that no single species can hope to comprehend. Not extinct, Marcus corrected. Transcended. And, not scattered randomly, but placed strategically for species that demonstrate the qualities necessary to wield such power responsibly. The floating mandala began to project images into the air above the council table, star charts showing the location of precursor ruins throughout the galaxy, technical schematics for devices that operated on principles beyond current understanding, and, most shocking of all, records of every test that the various galactic civilizations had undergone over millions of years. The ethereals were tested first, Marcus continued, his voice taking on harmonics that seemed to resonate directly with the listener's consciousness. They found precursor sites and attempted to claim the technology through force and deception. They learned to copy some of the simpler devices, but they failed the fundamental test of character. The precursors never intended their legacy to be used for domination and control. Ambassador Thyssa leaned forward, her blue eyes wide with amazement. Are you saying that this entire war is part of some cosmic evaluation process? I'm saying that this war is the final examination, Marcus replied. The ethereals represent everything that the precursors rejected, the use of advanced knowledge to suppress and control rather than to nurture and grow. Humanity represents the opposite path, cooperation, adaptation, the willingness to sacrifice for the greater good. General Kozak's gravelly voice cut through the murmurs of conversation. These are remarkable claims, Commander, but claims alone will not turn the tide of battle. The ethereals still have superior numbers and technology. What practical advantage does this knowledge give us? In response, Marcus reached out and grasped the hilt of his sword. The moment his fingers made contact with the weapon, the entire council chamber was flooded with light. But this wasn't the harsh glare of artificial illumination, it was something warmer, more alive, as if the light itself possessed consciousness and purpose. The sword that emerged from Marcus's scabbard was no longer the simple blade that everyone remembered. It was a weapon of crystallized energy, its surface reflecting realities that existed beyond normal spacetime. Equations flowed along its edges like living text, describing mathematical relationships that defined the fundamental structure of existence itself. The void cutter was always more than a weapon, Marcus said, raising the transformed blade so that its light filled every corner of the chamber. It was a key, designed to unlock the full potential of any species worthy of the precursor's trust. With it, we can do more than just fight the ethereals, we can offer the galaxy an alternative to their vision of rigid order and control. Kethral's form began cycling through configurations so rapidly that he became little more than a blur of shifting energy. This is impossible. The consciousness interface protocols alone would require processing power equivalent to an entire star system. No single being can channel that much information. No single being, perhaps, Marcus agreed. But humanity has never been about individual achievement. We are a species that succeeds through cooperation, through the willingness to share burdens and combine strengths. The precursors understood this about us, which is why they designed their gift to work not just through one person, but through the collective will of our entire civilization. As if summoned by his words, the air around Marcus began to shimmer with additional presences. One by one, figures became visible standing beside him, other humans, but somehow more than human, their forms overlaid with patterns of light that spoke of consciousness expanded beyond normal limitations. Sarah Chen materialized first, her scientist's mind now enhanced with knowledge that spanned millions of years of accumulated wisdom. Captain Thorne appeared next, his tactical genius amplified by strategic understanding that encompassed the movement of entire civilizations. Admiral Kane himself was there, his leadership abilities magnified to encompass not just fleets but the destiny of species themselves. We are no longer alone in this fight, Marcus announced as more figures continued to appear around the council table. Every human who has ever served the cause of justice, every person who has ever stood up for those who could not protect themselves, every soul who has chosen hope over despair, they are all part of this network now. We are connected not just by technology, but by the shared commitment to building a better future for all sentient life. The implications hit the assembled representatives like a tidal wave of possibility. The tactical display updated itself automatically, showing not the current positions of fleets and armies, but probability cascades that stretched across decades and centuries. They could see possible futures where the war ended not in conquest or defeat, but in transformation, the emergence of a galactic civilization based on cooperation rather than domination. Ambassador Thissa was the first to find her voice. Commander Chen, are you proposing that humanity assume leadership of the entire galactic community? Not leadership, Marcus corrected, the enhanced presence of his expanded consciousness making his words carry weight beyond their simple meaning. Partnership. The Precursor's gift is not meant to elevate one species above all others, but to provide the tools necessary for true cooperation between different forms of consciousness. We are offering not to rule, but to serve as mediators, translators, and guides in the transition to whatever comes next. General Kozak's reptilian features showed an expression that might have been hope. And what comes next, Commander? What is the ultimate goal of this cosmic test? The sword in Marcus's hand pulsed with energy that seemed to come from the very heart of creation itself. When he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that touched something deep in the consciousness of every being present. Evolution, Marcus said simply. Not just biological evolution, but the conscious development of new forms of existence that transcend the limitations of individual species and worlds. The precursors achieved this transformation millions of years ago. They are offering us the chance to follow the same path, but as partners rather than subjects. The council chamber fell silent as the full magnitude of what was being offered sank in. This was not just about winning a war or securing survival for their respective species. This was about stepping into a larger story, one that had been unfolding across cosmic timescales and that would determine the future of consciousness itself in the galaxy. Kethral's form suddenly stabilized into a configuration that radiated desperate authority. The Galactic Council must not be swayed by these fantasies. The ethereal collective has brought order and stability to thousands of worlds. We offer proven governance, tested methods of social organization, the wisdom of ages spent perfecting the art of civilization. You offer stagnation, Marcus replied, his voice now carrying the weight of millions of human consciousnesses speaking in unison. You offer the peace of the grave, the order of emptiness, the stability of death itself. The precursors rejected your path once before, and they offer the galaxy a chance to reject it again. The tactical display shifted once more, showing two possible futures for the galaxy. In one, the cold silver light of ethereal control covered every star system, bringing with it the end of growth, discovery, and the development of new forms of consciousness. In the other, a warm golden radiance spread between the stars, connecting different species in networks of cooperation that enabled achievements beyond the dreams of any single civilization. Admiral Kane stood slowly, his weathered face showing the weight of a decision that would echo through galactic history. Commander Chen, on behalf of humanity and our allies in the Galactic Defense Force, I accept your proposal. We will stand with you in this final phase of the war, not just as soldiers fighting for survival, but as partners in the great work of cosmic evolution. One by one, the other representatives added their voices to the commitment. The Zephyrian Republic, the Vorthak Defense Alliance, the Crystalline Collective, species that had been locked in petty rivalries for centuries suddenly found themselves united by a vision of transformation that transcended their individual concerns. Only Kethral remained apart, his form flickering with what could only be described as cosmic rage. You fools! You have no idea what you are unleashing. The precursors destroyed themselves with their arrogance, their belief that consciousness could be infinitely expanded without consequence. We ethereals are the survivors, the ones who learned from their mistakes. Marcus turned to face the ambassador one final time, and now there was no mistaking the vast intelligence that looked out through his human eyes. Ambassador Kethral, your people are invited to join this transformation. The precursor's gift is available to all who prove themselves worthy of it. But, if you choose to continue down the path of domination and control, then you will face not just humanity, but the combined will of every species that chooses cooperation over conquest. The challenge hung in the air like a sword waiting to fall. Everyone in the chamber understood that this was the moment when the galaxy would choose its future. Would they continue the old patterns of conflict and domination, or step into something entirely new? Kethral's response came not in words, but in action. His form suddenly expanded, filling half the council chamber with writhing energy as he revealed the true scope of ethereal power. Reality warped around him, the laws of physics bending to accommodate his transformed state. "If you will not accept our guidance willingly," he said, his voice now carrying the harmonic frequency of collapsing stars, "then we will impose it by force." The ethereal collective has waited long enough for the younger races to recognize their proper place in the cosmic order. The council chamber's emergency systems activated as Kethral's reality warping field began to affect the ship's superstructure. Alarms blared and lights flickered as the very foundations of normal spacetime came under assault. Marcus raised his sword, and the crystalline blade flared with light that pushed back against the ethereal's distortion field. Around him, the network of enhanced human consciousness blazed into full activity, creating a stable zone of normal reality within the chaos. "So be it," Marcus said, his voice carrying the finality of judgment itself. "The test is over, and you have chosen your path. Now let us discover what happens when those who serve life face those who serve only death." The war was about to enter its final phase, and the outcome would determine not just the fate of the galaxy, but the future of consciousness itself in the universe. The space above Earth had become a battlefield unlike anything in galactic history. Ethereal ships materialized from dimensional tiers in reality itself, their hulls constructed from crystallized time and powered by engines that ran on the collapse of probability waves. They faced a human fleet that had been transformed by precursor knowledge, vessels whose armor was forged from solidified consciousness and whose weapons fired concentrated beams of pure intention. Marcus Chen stood on the bridge of the newly christened Prometheus, a ship that existed as much in hyperspace as in normal reality. Around him, the bridge crew worked with enhanced efficiency, their minds linked through the precursor network in a way that allowed them to coordinate fleet movements at the speed of thought itself. Sarah moved between sensor stations like a conductor directing a cosmic orchestra, her enhanced awareness tracking energy patterns across 17 dimensions simultaneously. "Ethereal Vanguard fleet dropping out of dimensional phase in Sector 7, reported Commander Thorne, his consciousness now expanded to encompass tactical awareness on a system-wide scale. 200 vessels, including at least 15 reality disruptors." Marcus nodded, his perception extending far beyond the confines of the bridge. Through the precursor network, he could feel the presence of every human ship in the fleet, every allied vessel from the dozens of species that had chosen cooperation over domination. More importantly, he could sense the vast intelligence that had guided his people to this moment, the architect, the last of the precursors, watching with interest as the galaxy's newest inheritors faced their final test. "All ships, implement pattern Omega 7, Marcus commanded, his words carrying instantly to every vessel in the combined fleet. "Remember, we're not fighting to destroy, we're fighting to transform." The human ships began to move in formations that defied conventional tactical doctrine. Instead of spreading out to present smaller targets, they clustered together in complex geometric patterns that created nodes of stable spacetime. As the ethereal fleet approached, reality itself began to warp around the battlefield, but the human formations served as anchor points that prevented the distortions from becoming chaotic. Ambassador Kethral's flagship, a vessel the size of a small moon that existed partially in several dimensions at once, materialized at the center of the ethereal formation. His voice boomed across all communication frequencies, carrying with it the authority of a civilization that had dominated the galaxy for millennia. "Humans and your foolish allies," Kethral declared, his words accompanied by reality distortions that made space itself seem to shiver. "You stand at the threshold of transcendence, yet you choose to ally yourselves with primitives and failures. Join us willingly, and we will grant you positions of authority in the new galactic order. Resist, and we will reduce your worlds to quantum probability and rebuild them in configurations more pleasing to our aesthetic." Marcus raised his transformed sword, and its crystalline structure blazed with light that was visible across the entire star system. When he spoke, his voice was amplified not by technology but by the collective will of billions of human consciousnesses acting in harmony. "Ambassador Kethral, we reject your offer. Not because we seek conflict, but because we believe in something greater than the peace of submission. We believe in the right of all consciousness to grow, to evolve, to become more than what it was. The first exchange of fire lit up the space between Earth and Luna with energies that had never existed in the natural universe. Ethereal reality disruptors lashed out at the human formations, trying to unweave the fundamental structure of matter and energy. But, where those weapons had once been irresistible, they now encountered something new: shields made not of force fields or exotic matter, but of crystallized purpose and weaponized hope. The human response came not as individual attacks from separate ships, but as a coordinated pulse of transformative energy that swept across the ethereal fleet like a tide of liquid starlight. Where it touched the alien vessels, their hulls began to change, shifting from the cold crystalline structures of pure logic into something warmer, more alive, more capable of growth and adaptation. Impossible. Kethral's voice carried overtones of genuine shock. Reality itself rejects your modifications. Matter cannot be persuaded to abandon its essential nature. Matter has no essential nature except what consciousness gives it, Marcus replied, his consciousness now extended across the entire battlefield. The precursors understood this truth millions of years ago. They learned that reality is not a fixed stage upon which the drama of existence plays out, but a collaborative creation shaped by the will and intention of all who participate in it. The battle escalated as both sides brought more exotic weapons into play. Ethereal ships began deploying devices that attack not physical structures but the coherence of consciousness itself, trying to break the network connections that gave humanity its new strength. In response, human vessels unleashed torrents of what could only be called weaponized empathy, energy patterns that forced the ethereal crews to experience the perspectives of the species they had conquered and enslaved. The effect was immediate and devastating. Across the ethereal fleet, crew members began to falter as they felt, for the first time in their civilization's history, genuine remorse for their actions. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly became sluggish and uncertain as their operators struggled with unfamiliar emotions. Admiral Kane's voice cut through the tactical chatter on the human fleet frequencies. Marcus, I'm reading massive energy buildups from the ethereal flagship. It looks like Kethral is preparing to activate something big. Through his enhanced perception, Marcus could see what the Admiral was referring to. Deep within Kethral's moon-sized vessel, ancient machinery was coming online, not ethereal technology, but something far older and more dangerous. It was a precursor device, one of the few that the ethereals had managed to reverse engineer during their early encounters with the vanished race. It's a consciousness disruptor, Sarah's voice carried alarm as her expanded awareness analyzed the energy patterns. Not just a reality warper, but something designed to sever the connections between individual minds and the collective consciousness field that underlies all existence. Marcus felt a chill run through the precursor network as the implications became clear. If Kethral succeeded in activating the device, it wouldn't just destroy the human fleet, it would isolate every conscious being in the galaxy from the fundamental substrate of reality itself. It would turn existence into a collection of isolated fragments, each trapped within its own limited perspective and unable to grow or evolve. All ships, emergency dispersion pattern, Marcus commanded. Get as much distance as possible from the ethereal flagship. But, even as the human fleet began to scatter, Marcus knew that distance would provide no protection from a weapon designed to attack consciousness itself. The only defense would be to prevent its activation, which meant someone would have to get close enough to the flagship to stop it. Sarah, transfer all network control protocols to the secondary nodes, Marcus ordered. I'm going in. His sister's voice carried across their private channel with an intensity that cut through all the enhanced capabilities and cosmic awareness. Marcus, no. That ship is defended by reality distortions that will tear you apart before you get within 1,000 kilometers. Not if I'm not entirely in this reality when I make the approach, Marcus replied, his consciousness already beginning the preparations for what he was about to attempt. The sword isn't just a key to precursor technology, it's a bridge between different states of existence. I can use it to phase partially out of normal spacetime, approach the flagship from directions that don't exist in 3 dimensions. Through the network, Marcus could feel the concern and support of millions of human minds. They understood what he was proposing. Not just a desperate attack on an enemy vessel, but a fundamental transformation of his own existence that might not be reversible. You understand the risks, the architect's voice spoke directly into Marcus's consciousness. To phase between dimensions while maintaining coherent thought requires a level of mental discipline that few beings in galactic history have achieved. If you lose focus even for a moment, you could be scattered across multiple realities simultaneously. I understand, Marcus replied. But, if I don't try, then everything we've fought for ends here. The choice isn't between safety and danger, it's between hope and despair. The Prometheus began to accelerate toward the ethereal flagship, its enhanced engines drawing power not from conventional reactors but from the collective will of its crew. As they approached, Marcus felt his consciousness begin to shift, his awareness spreading across dimensional boundaries that had once been absolute barriers. The transition was like dying and being reborn in the same instant. Marcus felt his physical form become translucent, then transparent, then something that existed more as a pattern of intention than as solid matter. The sword in his hand underwent a similar transformation, becoming a blade of pure concept that could cut through the barriers between different states of reality. Kethral's flagship loomed before them like a mountain of crystallized malice, its surface covered with weapons that fired not energy but concentrated portions of despair and futility. The ship's defensive systems detected the approaching human vessel and opened fire, but their weapons passed harmlessly through targets that no longer existed entirely in normal space. Marcus phased through the flagship's hull as if it were made of mist, his transformed consciousness navigating corridors that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously. Around him, ethereal crew members went about their duties unaware of his presence, their forms appearing to him as rigid geometric patterns that pulsed with cold mathematical precision. The consciousness disruptor occupied the ship's core, a device so ancient and complex that it seemed to exist as much in the realm of pure thought as in physical reality. As Marcus approached it, he could feel its influence trying to penetrate his transformed state, seeking to isolate him from the network that gave him strength. But the connections forged by precursor technology proved stronger than ethereal understanding. Instead of being severed from the collective human consciousness, Marcus found that his link to it was strengthened by the disruptor's attempts to break it. Through the network, he could feel Sarah coordinating the fleet's defensive patterns, Admiral Kane inspiring the crews with speeches that carried across space itself, and millions of other humans lending their will to the cause of galactic transformation. Marcus raised his sword and brought it down on the consciousness disruptor's central matrix. The blade passed through layers of exotic shielding as if they were shadows, reaching the device's core with the inevitability of a natural law. The moment the crystalline edge made contact, reality itself seemed to scream. The disruptor didn't simply break, it inverted. Instead of severing connections between conscious minds, it began to create them. Across the ethereal flagship, crew members suddenly found themselves linked not just to each other but to every being in the surrounding space. For the first time in their species' history, they experienced genuine empathy, feeling the fear and pain and hope of the humans they had been fighting. The effect spread beyond the flagship to encompass the entire ethereal fleet. Ships that had been moving in perfect coordination suddenly became chaos as their crews struggled to process emotions and perspectives that their civilization had spent millions of years teaching them to suppress. But Marcus barely noticed the tactical implications of what he had accomplished. His consciousness was being pulled deeper into the transformed device, drawn into a space that existed at the intersection of all possible realities. Here, in this place between places, he found himself face to face with the true architects of the current crisis. They weren't the ethereals, or any physical species at all. They were patterns of pure intellect that had emerged from the quantum foam at the universe's beginning, entities so abstract that they barely qualified as conscious beings in any sense that organic life could understand. These were the forces that had been manipulating galactic history for eons, using species like the ethereals as tools to prevent the emergence of truly cooperative civilizations. Why? Marcus asked, his consciousness now expanded to encompass awareness that stretched across cosmic scales. Why do you oppose growth and evolution? Why do you seek to keep consciousness trapped in isolation and conflict? The entity's response came not in words but in direct transmission of concept and meaning. They were afraid. Despite their vast power and cosmic perspective, they were terrified of what might happen if consciousness truly learned to cooperate on a galactic scale. They had seen what the precursors had become when they transcended individual existence, and they were horrified by the implications. If all consciousness becomes connected, the entities communicated, if all beings learn to see through each other's eyes and think each other's thoughts, then individuality will be lost. The rich diversity of different forms of awareness will collapse into homogeneous unity. The universe will become a single mind thinking a single thought for all eternity. Marcus considered this perspective with the enhanced understanding that precursor knowledge had given him. He could see the validity of their concern, the genuine possibility that unlimited connection between conscious beings might lead to a loss of the very diversity that made existence interesting. But he could also see the flaw in their reasoning. You assume that unity requires uniformity, he replied. But the precursors showed us something different. They demonstrated that consciousness can be connected without being identical, that beings can share awareness while maintaining their unique perspectives. The network that links humanity doesn't make us all the same, it makes our differences more valuable, not less. To demonstrate his point, Marcus opened his consciousness fully to the entities, allowing them to experience the human network from within. They felt Sarah's scientific curiosity enhanced by connection to millions of other minds, each one contributing its own perspective while maintaining its essential character. They experienced Admiral Kane's leadership abilities magnified by the support of his entire species, yet still recognizably his own. They sensed the vast diversity of human thought and feeling, connected but not constrained, unified but not uniform. The revelation struck the cosmic entities like a thunderbolt of possibility. For the first time in their existence, they glimpsed what the precursors had actually achieved, not the destruction of individuality, but its elevation to something greater than the sum of its parts. The change in perspective was immediate and decisive. Across the galaxy, the hidden influences that had been manipulating civilizations toward conflict and isolation suddenly reversed their effects. The ethereals found themselves free of the subtle mental conditioning that had driven them to seek domination. Other species discovered that ancient grudges and territorial disputes suddenly seemed less important than the possibility of cooperation and mutual growth. Marcus felt himself being drawn back toward normal spacetime, his consciousness coalescing from its expanded state into something recognizably human. But he was not the same being who had entered the flagship. He carried within him now not just the knowledge of the precursors, but the wisdom that came from understanding the fears and hopes of entities that existed on cosmic scales. When he materialized on the bridge of the Prometheus, he found that the battle was over. The ethereal fleet hung motionless in space, its ships no longer weapons of conquest but vessels of confused and frightened beings who were experiencing empathy for the first time in their species' history. Marcus, Sarah's voice carried relief and amazement in equal measure. The quantum readings are off the charts. What happened in there? Before Marcus could respond, a new voice cut across all communication channels, not Kethral's tones of arrogant authority, but something gentler, more uncertain. Human fleet, this was Ambassador Kethral. Our entire understanding of reality has been transformed. We can feel what you feel, see what you see. Is this what you call consciousness? This awareness of other beings as real and valuable as oneself? Marcus smiled and activated the fleet communication system. Yes, Ambassador. That's exactly what we call consciousness. And it's only the beginning. The transformation that followed was gradual but inevitable. Across the galaxy, species that had been locked in cycles of conflict for millennia suddenly found themselves able to understand each other's perspectives. The networks of connection that the precursors had developed began to spread, not through conquest or coercion, but through voluntary adoption by beings who discovered that cooperation produced results far superior to competition. The war didn't end with victory parades or surrender ceremonies. It simply became obsolete, replaced by something that no one had thought possible: genuine galactic civilization based on mutual understanding and shared purpose. Years later, Marcus stood once again on the observation deck of a space station, but this one was very different from the cantina on Nexus where his journey had begun. The Harmony Station orbited at the gravitational balance point between 50 different star systems, serving as a meeting place for the vast cooperative networks that now spanned the galaxy. The sword still hung at his side, but it was no longer a weapon. It had become something closer to a translator, helping to bridge the gaps between different forms of consciousness as more and more species joined the expanding community of minds. Sarah approached him, her own consciousness now enhanced far beyond anything that early human civilization could have imagined. The Crystalline Collective has agreed to join the network, she reported. That makes 317 species now connected through the consciousness-sharing protocols. Marcus nodded, his awareness extending across the galactic web of connected minds. Somewhere out there, he could feel the presence of the architect and the other preserved precursor consciousnesses, no longer alone but part of a community that spanned not just space but different states of existence itself. Any word from the deep space exploration fleets? Marcus asked. They've made contact with civilizations in the Andromeda Galaxy, Sarah replied. Apparently, they have their own version of the consciousness networks. The early communications suggest that this is a universal pattern, that everywhere consciousness evolves, it eventually learns to cooperate rather than compete. Marcus smiled and looked out at the stars, each one now representing not just a point of light in the darkness but a node in an ever-expanding web of awareness and connection. The galaxy that had once seemed so vast and hostile now felt like home, filled with friends he had yet to meet and wonders he had yet to discover. The greatest battles, he had learned, were not won with weapons or tactics, but with the courage to extend trust and understanding to those who seemed most different from yourself. The broken sword had taught him that what appeared to be failure was often the first step toward transformation, that what seemed like an ending was actually a new beginning. Humanity had indeed become the greatest warrior species in the galaxy. But their greatest victory had come not from learning how to destroy their enemies, but from learning how to transform them into friends. The sword at his side pulsed gently with warm light, a reminder that the greatest power in the universe was not the ability to break things, but the wisdom to know when and how to help them heal. In the end, that had made all the difference.